To understand the birth of heroin, one must first understand the world into which it was born. In the mid-1800s, opium was not a street drug. It was the foundation of Western medicine. Derived from the sap of the Papaver somniferum, opium poppy, it was the only effective tool doctors had to manage severe pain, chronic cough, and dysentery. However, opium was bulky and inconsistent in strength. In 1804, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner succeeded in isolating the active alkaloid of opium, which he named morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine was a medical miracle, 10 times stronger than raw opium and easily injectable thanks to the invention of the hypodermic needle. But by the 1870s, a terrifying side effect had emerged: the army disease. Thousands of soldiers from the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War returned home hopelessly addicted to morphine. The medical world was desperate for a safe alternative, a drug that had the pain-killing power of morphine without its addictive grip. The quest for a non-addictive morphine began in London. In 1874, an English chemist named C.R. Alder Wright was experimenting at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School. He was interested in the chemical structure of morphine and began boiling it with various acids. By combining morphine with acetic anhydride, a concentrated form of the acid found in vinegar, he created a new compound, diacetylmorphine. Wright tested this new substance on dogs and rabbits. He noted that the animals became sleepy and their respiration slowed down significantly. However, Wright was a chemist, not a businessman. He published his findings in a scientific journal and moved on to other research. For the next 20 years, diacetylmorphine sat on a dusty shelf of chemical history, an ignored discovery that was about to change the world. The story shifts to Elberfeld, Germany, home to the laboratories of Farbenfabriken vorm Friedrich Bayer & Co., known today simply as Bayer. In the late 1900s, Bayer was a rising giant in the chemical industry. Their head of research, Heinrich Dresser, was obsessed with finding a drug that could treat respiratory illnesses, which were the leading cause of death at the time. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and the White Plague were ravaging Europe. In 1897, a brilliant young chemist named Felix Hoffmann, the same man who had successfully stabilized aspirin just 11 days earlier, turned his attention to Wright's forgotten formula. Hoffmann resynthesized diacetylmorphine, and Bayer's early tests showed it was incredibly effective at suppressing coughs. When Heinrich Dresser tested the drug on himself and his staff, they reported feeling heroic and energized. They didn't feel the heavy, lethargic stone of morphine. Instead, they felt a rush of well-being and power. Captivated by this feedback, Bayer officially trademarked the substance as heroin, derived from the German word heroic. Bayer launched a marketing campaign that would be unthinkable today. Heroin was marketed as a wonder drug. It was touted as 10 times more effective than codeine for coughs, and, most importantly, as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. Bayer claimed that heroin did not cloud the mind or cause the physical cravings associated with opium. It was the safe solution the medical world had been praying for. By 1898, heroin was being exported to 23 countries. It came in the form of syrups, lozenges, salts, and even heroin-laced tampons for menstrual pain. Because it was so effective at stopping a cough by depressing the central nervous system, it was used to treat everything from the common cold to asthma. It was even marketed for children. Advertisements appeared in newspapers showing mothers giving their crying infants Bayer heroin syrup to help them sleep or stop a fussy cough. At this stage, heroin was a legal, over-the-counter medicine, sitting right next to the aspirin in the family cabinet. What the scientists at Bayer didn't understand yet was the chemistry of how heroin worked in the brain. When diacetylmorphine, heroin, enters the body, Its chemical structure allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier much faster than morphine. Once inside the brain, the body converts it back into morphine. Essentially, heroin was a delivery system that shot morphine into the brain with a speed and intensity that created a massive surge of dopamine, a rush far more powerful than morphine could ever achieve. The heroic feeling the Bayer staff felt was actually the beginning of a physical dependency far more severe than anything the world had seen before. By 1899, Bayer was producing 1 ton of heroin a year. The drug was not merely a niche product, it was a cornerstone of the pharmaceutical industry. Bayer's marketing department was relentless. They sent out thousands of free samples to doctors across Europe and North America, along with pamphlets printed in dozens of languages. In the United States, heroin was hailed as a miracle in the fight against the White Plague, tuberculosis. At a time when TB was the leading cause of death and there was no cure, the only way to treat patients was to manage their symptoms. Heroin suppressed the violent, rib-cracking coughs of TB patients and gave them a sense of euphoria that masked their physical decline. It was the ultimate palliative care, and the medical community embraced it with open arms. One of the most tragic chapters of this era was the promotion of heroin as a cure for morphine addiction. Thousands of people who had become hooked on morphine during the 19th century were told by their physicians that they could switch to heroin to wean themselves off. Medical journals from 1900 to 1905 are filled with testimonials from doctors claiming that heroin had none of the toxic effects of morphine. They believed that because heroin was so potent, patients would need only tiny doses, which would somehow prevent addiction. In reality, they were feeding a fire with gasoline. Patients simply traded a morphine habit for a heroin habit that was 3 times stronger and far harder to break. In the early 1900s, U.S. drug laws were almost non-existent. There was no FDA to regulate safety or claims. This led to the patent medicine boom. Companies created soothing syrups and tonic wines that contained significant amounts of heroin, cocaine, and alcohol. Middle-class housewives, elderly people with arthritis, and even children were consuming heroin daily. It was sold in beautifully designed bottles with names like glycoheroin and heroin hydrochloride. For many, the energy and well-being provided by these tonics became a necessary part of daily life. Society was becoming addicted, but because the drug was legal and endorsed by doctors, the stigma did not yet exist. The honeymoon period did not last long. As early as 1902, isolated reports began to trickle in from hospitals in New York and Philadelphia. Doctors were seeing patients who exhibited a terrifying new craving. These patients were not just taking heroin for a cough, they were taking it to feel normal. In 1903, the benevolent image of the drug started to crack. A German physician named Pasteur cautioned that heroin was far from harmless. He noted that users required larger and larger doses to achieve the same effect, the first clinical description of tolerance. More alarming were the reports of withdrawal. When the drug was stopped, patients suffered from violent tremors, nausea, cold sweats, and agonizing bone pain. The heroic drug was revealing its teeth. While many were becoming accidental addicts through medicine, a new phenomenon was emerging in the urban centers of America. In the underbelly of cities like New York, the recreational use of heroin began to take root. In the infamous Tenderloin district and the docks of the West Side, people discovered that snorting the white powder provided a rush far more intense than any medicine. This was the birth of the junkie subculture. The term junkie originally referred to heroin addicts who collected scrap metal and junk to sell so they could afford their next dose. The drug was moving out of the pharmacy and into the street. By 1906, the evidence was undeniable. the American Medical Association, AMA, began to receive a flood of complaints regarding heroin addiction. Under pressure, the U.S. government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which mandated that labels must list the ingredients of medicines. For the first time, people realized they were feeding their children diacetylmorphine. Bayer, sensing a looming legal and public relations disaster, began to quietly scale back its promotion of heroin. They shifted their focus entirely to aspirin, which was proving to be their true long-term success. By 1910, Bayer stopped making heroin altogether, but the damage was done. They had opened Pandora's box, and the world was now filled with millions of people whose bodies screamed for the drug. By 1910, the wonder drug era was officially over. What had started as a pharmaceutical miracle was now recognized as a medical catastrophe. The American Medical Association, AMA, which had once praised heroin, now faced a grim reality. Thousands of respectable citizens, housewives, businessmen, and veterans were hopelessly addicted. The clinical data was horrifying. Studies showed that heroin was not just a stronger version of morphine, it was a more insidious one. Because it was fat-soluble, it hit the brain like a lightning bolt. Physicians began to report that heroin withdrawal was significantly more violent than morphine withdrawal, often resulting in severe cardiovascular distress and profound psychological collapse. The medical community, feeling betrayed by Bayer's initial marketing, turned on the drug with a vengeance. As the medical supply began to tighten, the face of addiction changed. In the early 1900s, an addict was often seen as a victim of medical misfortune, but by 1915, the street user had emerged in major American cities. In New York City, particularly in the slums of the Lower East Side, young men were seen scavenging for scrap metal, old iron, and junk to sell to dealers for their next fix. This gave birth to the pejorative term junkie. As the drug moved from the pharmacy to the alleyway, the public's perception shifted from pity to fear. Heroin was no longer a medicine, it was a vice, associated with poverty, crime, and the moral decay of the urban youth. The United States government realized that the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which only required labeling, was not enough to stop the crisis. In 1914, they passed the Harrison Narcotic Act. This was a pivotal moment in global history, as it was the first major step toward the war on drugs. Technically, the act was a tax law. It required anyone who produced, imported, or distributed opium or coca leaves to register with the government and pay a tax. However, the courts interpreted this law in a way that effectively banned doctors from prescribing heroin to addicts for maintenance. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people who were physically dependent on the drug found themselves transformed into criminals overnight.
Their legal supply was cut off, and they had nowhere to go but the black market. With legal production by companies like Bayer and Eli Lilly slowing down, the law of supply and demand took over. Organized crime saw a massive opportunity. Smuggling rings began to form, moving raw opium from the Middle East and East Asia into secret laboratories in Europe, particularly in France and Italy, where it was refined into high-grade heroin. This was the beginning of the French Connection routes. Criminal syndicates realized that heroin was the perfect product for smuggling. It was a concentrated powder, easy to hide, and the customers were captured. They had to buy it, regardless of the price or the danger. The transition from a regulated pharmaceutical to an unregulated street poison was complete. By the early 1920s, heroin had become public enemy number one in America. Unlike alcohol, which had many supporters during Prohibition, almost no one defended heroin. The Red Scare and a general fear of foreign influences led to a belief that drugs were being used to weaken the American spirit. In 1924, the the United States Congress passed the Anti-Heroin Act. This law made it illegal to manufacture or possess heroin, even for medicinal purposes. The drug was completely scrubbed from the American pharmacopoeia. The world's leading medical superpower had declared total war on the substance. The total ban in the U.S. had an immediate and global effect. As the legal factories in the West closed their heroin lines, production shifted to places where the law was weak. Shanghai, Cairo, and Marseille became hubs for the underground trade. The ban did not stop the addiction. It only made the drug more expensive and more dangerous. Because there was no longer any quality control, dealers began cutting heroin with sugar, starch, or toxic chemicals to increase their profits. The junkie was now not only fighting addiction, but also the constant threat of poisoning and overdose from impure supplies. During the late 1930s and through the Second World War, the international heroin trade was largely disrupted. Shipping lanes were militarized, borders were sealed, and the traditional routes from the opium fields of the East to the labs in the West were severed. For a brief moment, the global addiction rate dropped as the supply chain collapsed. However, the end of the war in 1945 created a new, more dangerous world. In the ruins of post-war Europe, especially in the port city of Marseille, France, a new criminal power emerged. The Corsican Mafia, taking advantage of the political instability and their control over the docks, began to rebuild the heroin trade. This was the birth of the infamous French Connection. The French Connection was the most sophisticated drug trafficking ring in history up to that point. The system was simple but deadly efficient. Raw opium was harvested in the Golden Crescent, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, shipped to Marseille and refined into nearly 100% pure white heroin in secret laboratories hidden in the French countryside. From Marseille, the heroin was smuggled into New York City, often hidden inside luxury cars, the heels of shoes, or even in the bodies of dead fish. During the 1950s and 60s, it's estimated that 80 to 90% of all heroin on American streets came from these French labs. This era saw the rise of the American Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, as the primary distributors, turning heroin into a multi-billion-dollar illicit industry. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the heroin crisis found a new and tragic epicenter: the jungles of Southeast Asia. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers were stationed in the Golden Triangle, the border region where Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos meet. This area produced massive amounts of high-grade number 4 white heroin. For the soldiers, the drug was incredibly cheap and easily available. Many turned to it to cope with the trauma, boredom, and horror of the war. By 1971, it was estimated that 10 to 15% of all U.S. servicemen in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. This created a national scandal in the U.S. When these soldiers returned home, they didn't just bring back medals, they brought back a physical dependency that fueled a massive surge in domestic heroin use throughout the 1970s.
In 1972, a combined effort by French and American law enforcement finally dismantled the French Connection labs in Marseille. But as one head of the Hydra was cut off, another grew. The center of gravity for heroin production shifted permanently to the Golden Triangle. Warlords like Kun Sa became the new kings of opium. They commanded private armies and controlled vast territories in the mountains of Myanmar. They moved from producing raw opium to refining it into heroin locally, making the drug even more potent and easier to smuggle. The 1970s and 80s were defined by this Asian white heroin, which flooded the streets of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York. By the 1980s, the heroin epidemic had become a central political issue in the West. President Richard Nixon had officially declared a war on drugs in 1971, but by the Reagan era, the rhetoric reached a fever pitch. Despite the billions spent on interdiction and policing, heroin use continued to ravage inner-city neighborhoods. In the 1980s, heroin was often overshadowed in the media by the crack cocaine epidemic, but it remained a silent killer. It was during this decade that a new horror emerged: HIV/AIDS. Because heroin was frequently injected, the sharing of needles became a primary driver for the spread of the virus. A heroin addiction was no longer just a slow path to ruin. It was now a potential death sentence from an incurable disease. In the 1990s, heroin underwent a strange and disturbing cultural transformation. In the world of high fashion and grunge music, a look emerged known as heroin chic. Models were styled to look emaciated, with dark circles under their eyes and pale, translucent skin, mimicking the appearance of an addict. Icons of the era, most notably Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, struggled publicly with heroin addiction. This glamorization of the drug coincided with a new surge in use among middle-class youth. By the mid-90s, the purity of street heroin had increased so much that users could get high by snorting or smoking it, removing the stigma and fear of needles for a new generation. As the world entered the 21st century, the geography of heroin shifted one final time. While the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia began to diversify its economy, Afghanistan became the undisputed opium capital of the world. Following the geopolitical chaos of the Soviet-Afghan War and the subsequent rise of the Taliban, opium became the only viable cash crop for impoverished farmers. By the early 2000s, Afghanistan was producing over 90% of the world's illicit opium. The Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, became a massive industrial machine for heroin. Even during the US-led war in Afghanistan, heroin production reached record highs. The heroin trade became inextricably linked to global terrorism and local insurgency, as the drug's profits funded weapons and warfare. This Afghan white flooded Europe and Russia, creating a massive wave of addiction and health crises across Eurasia. While Afghan heroin was flowing east, a new crisis was brewing in the West, one that started not in a hidden lab, but in a doctor's office. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, pharmaceutical companies in the United States, led by Purdue Pharma, began aggressively marketing a new prescription painkiller, OxyContin. Marketed as a safe and non-addictive long-term solution for chronic pain, OxyContin was essentially a chemical cousin to heroin. Millions of Americans were prescribed these pills for back pain, dental work, and minor injuries. When the medical community finally realized the scale of the addiction and began tightening prescriptions, millions of people were left physically dependent. These people, unable to get legal pills, turned to the cheapest and most available alternative on the street: heroin. For the first time in history, the typical heroin user was not a street junkie in an inner city, but a middle-class teenager or a suburban parent. Seeing this massive new demand in America, the Mexican drug cartels, most notably the Sinaloa cartel, transformed their business model. They shifted from being mere transporters of cocaine to being massive producers of black tar and brown powder heroin. The cartels streamlined the delivery process, using pizza delivery-style systems to bring heroin directly to small-town America. This eliminated the need for open-air drug markets and made the drug more accessible than ever before. Between 2002 and 2013, the rate of heroin-related overdose deaths in the U.S. quadrupled.
Heroin was no longer a hidden subculture, it was a national emergency. Around 2014, the game changed forever. The world moved from organic drugs, grown in fields, to synthetic drugs, made in labs. Enter fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid originally developed for cancer patients.
It is 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. For the cartels and traffickers, fentanyl was a dream come true. You didn't need thousands of acres of poppies or a growing season. You only needed a small laboratory and cheap precursor chemicals from China. Because fentanyl is so potent, a small amount, the size of a few grains of salt, can be a lethal dose. Traffickers began mixing fentanyl into the heroin supply to boost its potency. This led to a catastrophic spike in accidental overdoses. Users who thought they were using their usual dose of heroin were actually injecting a lethal dose of fentanyl. The impact of this synthetic surge has been nothing short of apocalyptic. In the United States and Canada, life expectancy actually dropped for several years due to the overdose crisis. Tens of thousands of people began dying every year, more than the number of Americans killed in the entire Vietnam War annually. The crisis forced a radical rethink of drug policy. Cities began implementing harm reduction strategies, supervised injection sites, the widespread distribution of Narcan, naloxone, a nasal spray that can reverse an opioid overdose in seconds, and needle exchange programs. The war on drugs approach of the 1980s, arresting and jailing users, was seen by many as a failure as the death toll continued to rise regardless of police intervention. The future, a world in recovery. As we stand in the mid-2020s, the history of heroin has come full circle. The drug that Bayer once sold as a cough syrup has evolved into a global hydra of synthetic opioids. However, there is a glimmer of hope. Medical science is fighting back with medication-assisted treatment, using substances like buprenorphine and methadone to stabilize addicts and allow them to lead normal lives. Public perception is shifting toward treating addiction as a chronic brain disease rather than a moral failure. The story of heroin is a cautionary tale about human ingenuity and its unintended consequences. From the labs of 19th century Germany to the poppy fields of Helmand and the synthetic labs of today, it is a history of our search for a painless life and the terrible price we have paid for it. The poppy is one of the most beautiful flowers on earth, yet it carries within it a power that has toppled empires and ruined millions of lives. As long as humans feel pain, both physical and emotional, there will be a demand for the numbing embrace of the opioid. The history of heroin is not over. It is simply entering a new